everyone, my name is Ashka and welcome to my YouTube channel. So on this channel, I'm primarily producing video essays covering film, TV, pop culture, new media, pretty much anything is fair game. I primarily focus on the Indian diaspora, but clearly today we're not going to be talking about that. But if any of that interests you, please give this video a thumbs up and please subscribe to the channel. This is going to be more of a lighthearted video of me just talking about my favorite Rewatch podcasts and reviewing them. So I know people have a lot of thoughts on the Rewatch podcast, and Tiffany Ferg actually made a whole video essay about millennial nostalgia and kind of the rise of the Rewatch podcast. My thoughts on the Rewatch podcast is if it's making you money and it's something that you want to do, go for it. You know, when you're a working actor or working writer or any other kind of career where your income is not consistent, it's more based on like the gigs that you can do and pick up, it is a smart idea to start a Rewatch podcast, especially if there's a demand for it, and especially if you can get a good group of hosts together. You can make money for multiple years. You know, if your show went on for 5, 6, 7 seasons, you know, you can make this podcast last a really long time, and you can bring on guests and they get a platform as well. And I just think it's a good way to bring people together. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Clearly, like, I'm the target audience for these Rewatch podcasts. Like, I eat them up. I guess I don't have a lot of critical things to say, but if you don't want to listen, then don't listen. It's pretty much that simple. So let's dive into our first Rewatch podcast review. Hey guys, it's Editing Me here. Excuse my unmade bed. I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer before we start the video. So this video was filmed prior to the release of the Quiet on Set documentary. And if you've been following that documentary, you know that Will Friedle and Ryder Strong are in some hot water right now because of their involvement in a specific court case that was covered in the documentary. And upon hearing this, I definitely felt very icky, and I am still taking the time to process and evaluate how I feel about them and if I want to continue to give them my support. But in this video, I do cover 2 podcasts that one or both of them are involved in, and I just wanted to be very clear that, you know, I do speak very highly of them, but that is not necessarily my opinion on them at the moment. But this video was ready to be put out. It was fully edited, and I just wanted to get it out there. So yeah, I just wanted to make that quick disclaimer. So yeah, enjoy the video. Okay, so the first podcast I'm going to be discussing is the podcast Pod Meets World, which is a Rewatch podcast of Boy Meets World. I don't know if they're going to do Girl Meets World, but I hope they do. This podcast is hosted by Ryder Strong, who plays Sean on Boy Meets World, Danielle Fishel, who plays Topanga, and Will Friedle, who plays Eric. We're starting off on a high. This is one of my favorite Rewatch podcasts for a variety of reasons. So I didn't grow up watching Boy Meets World. I actually watched it for the first time, I think during COVID when I got Disney+. So I believe I finished Boy Meets World maybe a little bit less than a year ago. And I did like the show, and I just was curious, so I started listening to this podcast. I think the biggest reason I really love this podcast is the dynamic and the chemistry between the hosts. So Ryder, Danielle, and Will have all been friends for over 30 years. And it's just really fun to like hear these longtime friends rambling about their lives and their inside jokes and kind of speaking about whatever they feel to speak on. You know, they do have like pre-show banter. It can go on a little long sometimes, but I listen through it. Another reason why I love this podcast is because the recaps are very in-depth and thorough. If you're a super fan of Boy Meets World, you're going to love Pod Meets World. I mean, I've only seen it once, and I really, really love the way that they recap. Danielle Fishel is the one who does the recaps. Her words, not mine. She is type A, and so she's very specific on the recaps. They go scene by scene. They talk about what was going on behind the scenes. They talk about how they feel about certain performances, the theme of the episode. So if you haven't seen the show in a while, you can definitely still listen to this podcast and you you'll be able to like picture the scenes in your head. As long as you know who the characters are, you can pretty much listen and get a really good idea of what the episode is about. So I really, really like that aspect about this podcast. And then another reason why I love this podcast is because they are very open and candid about their experiences working on the show. They talk a lot about what happened behind the scenes, and some of those things aren't so positive. One of the things they discuss is Michael Jacobs, who is the creator of Boy Meets World. And, he had a little bit of a temper and he was very particular about how he wanted things. So they're not afraid to kind of call him out on those. And something else they discussed about Michael Jacobs was actually Michael Jacobs is the co-creator of Boy Meets World. There was a second person who created the show named April Kelly. And April Kelly was mysteriously fired, or she kind of disappeared after season 1. The hosts of the podcast, they don't really know why, right? Because they were children when they were on the show. They'd never questioned what was going on in the writer's room or what was going on the producer's side. Like they didn't, discuss those things understandably because they were kids and they were just kind of doing what they were told. But now that they're recapping the show, they're bringing on writers from the show. They're bringing on producers, everybody who can kind of speak to this incident, if you will. And some people are on Michael Jacobs' side. Some people are on April Kelly's side. But the hosts objectively listen to everybody and they kind of make this claim that, hey, we don't know what actually went down, but here are the accounts from several people. So it's like investigative journalism. Another kind of more lighthearted drama that they talk about on this podcast is the drama with Adam Scott. So Adam Scott, who, yes, played Ben Wyatt in Parks and Rec, he was actually on Boy Meets World for 2 to 3, maybe 4 episodes of Boy Meets World. And they did interview him, which was really fun. But Adam Scott told this story, I believe it was season 2. They wrapped the season. And Adam Scott kind of goes up to Ryder and says like, oh, good job, and kind of like wants to hug him or something. And Ryder Strong is like smiling, but then his like smile fades and he just kind of looks at him and walks away. And Adam Scott had no idea why Ryder did that. So this one moment that they had, which Ryder says, oh, that's so out of character for me. I don't know why I would ever do something like that. Like, I'm usually like a hugger. Like, I'm so sorry. I don't know why I would do something like that. They interview people from like the bully gang, because Adam Scott played like a bully on the show. So whoever he acted alongside, when they interviewed them, they brought up the Adam Ryder hug controversy and they just like got people's opinions on it. They're so invested in not only the show itself, but also the lore behind the show. And I really, really love that. And then something else they also acknowledge is Ben Savage. So Ben Savage played Corey Matthews on Boy Meets World. He was the boy who met World, right? They spoke about this on the very first episode of the podcast, that they asked Ben Savage to be a part of this and he said no. They didn't elaborate onto why he said no. But they just said he doesn't want to be a part of this. We respect that. And we decided to just proceed without him. If you guys know, like Ben Savage, I think he's like running for Congress or something in California. And he recently got married and none of the Boy Meets World co-stars were invited to the wedding. And Will Friedle has talked about how him and Ben have mysteriously like just stopped being friends. I think he said he would text Ben every day for like a few months and would get no response. And eventually Will's wife was like, maybe it's time to let this go. But Will still doesn't have any idea of like why they're no longer friends. And I think just that openness is so unique to this podcast. Like they're even discussing things that are happening currently, not just, the stuff that happened like 30 years ago. They also interview like each other's parents, like Danielle's mom came on, Ryder's parents, Will's father, they all appeared on the podcast. They interview their on-set teacher, their stage manager, hair and makeup, costumes, casting. Like they interview so many people and it's really wholesome to listen to because they all have really, really great relationships with those people still. I think because when they did Girl Meets World, they rehired a lot of the crew that had worked on Boy. And it's just really fun to see them interact. They also talk about their experiences as child actors. Like Will and Ryder have talked about what it was like to kind of kiss a different girl every week, in every episode. If you've seen the show, there's a lot of like making out and stuff. So they talk about their experiences with that. Danielle talks about what it was like to be a young girl and, being sexualized. And I'm sure as the seasons go on, she's going to speak more about that. But again, I just love how honest they are. They're candid. So they also talk about the show itself and different storylines. They are talking about Corey and Topanga's relationship, which, like, if you know, you know. Are they couple goals? I don't think so. I like that the hosts kind of acknowledge that and they discuss, like, oh, this storyline didn't work for me and here's why, and they're critical about their own show that they were on. And I actually enjoy that. I've seen some reviews of the podcast that say the hosts are like too critical of the show. And I disagree with that. I think they are critical when they need to be, but they also praise the show a lot. And they praise actors' performances. They praise each other's performances. They praise the writing, the storylines. I think they praise even more than they criticize. You will get some tea if you listen to this podcast. It's just like a good time. I don't know. It feels like you're just listening to like longtime friends just discuss things. So it goes without saying, I'm rating this podcast a 5 out of 5. If you've seen the show, go listen to the podcast. Starting off strong, Pod Meets World, 5 out of 5. The next podcast I'm going to be talking about is Office Ladies. Office Ladies is a rewatch podcast for The Office, which is one of my favorite shows. I have the Kelly Kapoor Funko Pop back there, if you can see. This podcast is hosted by Jenna Fisher, who played Pam, and Angela Kinsey, who played Angela on The Office. So Jenna and Angela are best friends in real life. So again, it's really fun to listen to them interact. They are like older. when they speak, it's kind of similar to like when you hear your mom talking to like her friends, you know what I mean? Like that's kind of the vibe that these ladies give, but I really like their vibe. I think again, it's really nice to like witness their friendship and just listen to these two talk about the show that made them famous and gave them their big break. They've talked very openly about how they were both struggling actors, and this show really gave them the break that they needed. And I think because of that, they've had a very, very, very positive experience working on the show. The two of them, met on set, became best friends, and now they've sort of built this whole empire. They've written several books together. Now they have this podcast. So they have a very positive experience, which means we're not going to get any tea spilling in this podcast. There's no tea to spill from their point of view. And I don't think there are any really controversies of the filming of the show or anything like that. But because they are both very well connected, they bring on top-notch guests. So like everybody you can think of, John Krasinski, Mindy Kaling, even Steve Carell, BJ Novak, Rainn Wilson comes on several times. Pretty much everybody you can think of in the Office cast, Melora Hardin, who I love, they all appear as guests. And if they don't appear as guests, they at least send in like an audio clip giving their insight into specific scenes. And what I love about this podcast, again, is the thorough nature of the recaps. They're going scene by scene. And something that this podcast does that's more unique is that they focus more on like how certain things were made. Let's say there's a stunt, right? They'll go into a lot of detail on how that stunt was done. Did the actor do the stunt themselves? Was there a double? If there's a visual gag, how did they do that? Like they covered Kevin spilling the chili and how they did that, how they cleaned all that up afterwards and kind of what their game plan was. The lip sync that they did, just all these iconic scenes, the fire cold open. They go into a lot of detail on how they made that. So I think it's really fun, again, to like hear how things were made behind the scenes. And Jenna and Angela, they're in touch with like Steve Burgess, who was the production manager on the show. They're in touch with Randy Cordray, who I believe was the production manager before Steve Burgess. They're also in touch with like the prop master, like the person who was in charge of making all the props and all that. So they go into a lot of depth on like how certain things were made. And I think that's really good because The Office, it's a cultural phenomenon. Even today, like it's one of the most watched shows. And so I don't think they need to go into a lot of detail on the characters and the plot and what happens because there's already a lot of discourse about that. So I think what the two of them can provide that's unique is they have all these connections to people who worked behind the scenes and they can talk about like with the writers, why did they write this specific storyline? or with the production manager, how was this done? Or with the DP, how was this shot? Like they can talk about all those things. And I think that's really fun. So something I'm a little more critical about with this podcast is the tangents. So the two of them do go on like a lot of tangents about random things. Again, it's like listening to your mom gab with her friends. They do like deep dives on certain topics. Like I listened to one where they did a deep dive on why women take their husbands' last names when they get married, the origin behind that and how that started. I think like those things are fun to an extent, but they're not relevant to the episode itself. So it kind of takes away from the recap when they do go on all these tangents. I think the two of them just have really great chemistry that I don't mind listening to them like talk about these other things as well. It was really nice to hear about, as the show progressed, how their fame increased and how opportunities for them went up. They got to be in magazine shoots. They went to like award shows, red carpets. They discuss, kind of the behind the scenes of what that night was like, because they're just like normal average people, I guess, who like suddenly became famous. So it's really nice to hear from that perspective, like what goes on in a red carpet, what happens in these award shows. I think those are like really like fun tidbits that we get from them. So they don't talk about any like tea behind the scenes, but they do talk about questionable behavior from some of the characters. Specifically Michael and Jim. They talk about it freely, but I think The Office, every character has done something problematic. Again, I think their focus on the production itself and how something was made is really fun. I think that's the highlight for me for this podcast. So Office Ladies, I'm giving a 4 out of 5. The only thing, again, like I said, was like the deep dives. Maybe they could hold back on those a little bit. But they're almost done with the recap. They're on season 9. I don't know what they're going to do afterwards. I know they've kind of discussed it, that they're thinking about what they're going to do after. So we'll see how long it lasts. But this podcast started in 2019. So like, it's okay for them to stop. But I would recommend listening to this if you're an Office fan, especially at the beginning. Like, it's really fun to listen to them. So the next podcast I'm going to be talking about is the podcast Parks and Recollection, which is the Rewatch podcast for the show Parks and Recreation. So this podcast was originally hosted by Alan Yang, who was a writer on the show, and Rob Lowe, who played Chris Traeger. And then they switched over to Greg Levine, who was the writer's assistant, and I believe he was promoted to staff writer during the show, and Jim O'Hare, who played Jerry, Larry, Gary, Barry. So with Alan and Rob, the podcast wasn't that great for a variety of reasons. The first one was the recaps were not even recaps, really. They were reading what they call the synopsis of the episode, and they kind of go sentence by sentence and like sort of talk about the episode itself. When Alan and Rob were hosting, a lot of the podcast was about a general discussion of like how a writer's room works and how actors get into their headspace and things like that. It's not focused on the show and like what happens in the episodes. It's more focused on Rob and Alan and kind of how their jobs worked. I went to school for screenwriting, so I like to know kind of what happens in the writer's room. But if you're just a fan of Parks and Rec and you're listening to this podcast, it's okay. I kept pushing on because I thought it would get better. And it did get slightly better under Alan and Rob, but I would say they were clearly doing this podcast as like a cash grab. They weren't that passionate about the show. Of course, they praised the show. They loved their time working on the show, but I think both of them had moved past the show. A really great example of this is, Greg Levine has always been a producer of the podcast. So Greg Levine would chime in every so often with Alan and Rob, and Alan Yang couldn't remember a lot of the details of what happened on set. But Greg Levine knew everything because he was the writer's assistant. And if you're the writer's assistant, you have to know everything that's going on in the room, on set. That's kind of your job. So he remembered more than the host of the podcast. So clearly they weren't researching very much. Maybe they were just watching the episode right before they started recording. They didn't give anything very thorough or anything really new for us to learn. When they switched over to Greg and Jim O'Hare, the podcast, I wouldn't say did a complete 180, but maybe like 120 degrees. Okay, maybe it like rotated a little bit. Jim and Greg are way more passionate about the show. They go into more depth into the scenes. They praise the show a lot. They don't discuss scene by scene like the other podcasts I've mentioned, but they do go into a little bit more detail than the other, hosts did. And it's clear that they care a lot more about the show, but it's still not completely there where like Pod Meets World is or Office Ladies. But it is what it is. It's just a different kind of style of recapping. They brought on Natalie Morales. They brought on Chelsea Peretti, who was a writer on the show. So they do bring on some cool guests. They do have some cool discussions. But for the most part, this one is a little bit lackluster for me. What it is really good at, though, is the theme song, okay? The theme song for this podcast is probably the best one I've seen out of all the podcasts. It's so catchy and so good. It's like playing in my head right now. The theme song is like mouse rat vibes. If you haven't seen Parks and Rec in a long time, you might not remember the episode well enough to be able to listen to the podcast episode and enjoy it. Overall, I'm giving this one a 3 out of 5. So next up, I'm going to be talking about Braving the Elements, which is the Rewatch podcast for Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra. So I'm wearing my Avatar shirt for this recap. And then I also have Suki's Funko Pop back there if you can see. So Avatar is my favorite show of all time. So clearly I'm biased here, but I really, really enjoyed this podcast. This podcast is hosted by Janet Varney, who is the voice of Korra, and Dante Bosco, who is the voice of Zuko. They are super, super, super passionate about the show. They love talking about not only the show, but also the Avatar universe. And because this is a Nickelodeon official podcast, they're able to use sound bites from the show itself. So they played Leaves from the Vine during this podcast. They're playing all these iconic lines and music from the show, and they're able to kind of use all of that material, which is so fun and exciting. And the two hosts, like I said, are like super, super passionate about the show, about the world. I would say this podcast is super immersive into the world of Avatar. Even though it's an animated show, obviously it's so beloved by so many people. And Janet and Dante really embrace that. And they never make it feel like, oh, it's childish, this is made for kids. Like, no, they take it super, super seriously. The only thing I will say about this podcast is, again, the recaps and the thoroughness of the recaps. I wish they would go into more detail, again, scene by scene, discussing what happens in the episode. They do cover certain scenes, but I think they do like gloss over some things. I mean, I'm a super fan, so I want to hear everything about everything, I think they could make the recap episodes longer. I think the recap episodes are between like 35 to 40 minutes. But overall, I think they are handling this podcast super, super well. They bring on the original creators of the show a lot. So the original creators are giving their thoughts, their inputs. Again, I think because it's a Nickelodeon podcast, they're able to bring everybody on. The creators, the voice actors. They just did an interview with the author of the graphic novels and the voice actor behind the audiobooks. They just did an interview with them. They interview super fans. There's just a lot of discussion. There's a lot of raving about the show. It's such a fun time. And I look forward to listening every week. Braving the Elements, I'm giving it a 4.5 out of 5. I think the use of those sound bites is so good, and the hosts are amazing. And if you're a fan like me, you'll definitely enjoy this podcast. The next podcast I'm going to be talking about is Magical Rewind. This podcast is hosted by Will Friedle, once again, and Sabrina Bryan, who you probably know from the Cheetah Girls franchise. So this is a relatively new podcast where they're recapping DCOM's Disney Channel original movies, and they're also going to be recapping films from the wonderful world of Disney, which I guess they released some films in like the 60s under that category. So they're going to be reviewing those. For me, when a podcast first starts out, I do give them some grace because I think it takes a while for them to maybe find their footing and for the host to like have better chemistry. I mean, I don't think Will and Sabrina knew each other before. Maybe here and there, but they're definitely not like really close friends. So that same chemistry isn't really there. But then again, they've only recapped, I think, 4 films so far. So they're still finding their stride. I do have some criticism for this podcast, though. The first DCOM I can remember watching is like Stuck in the Suburbs, and I think that was like 2003 that came out. So like anything before that, like Brink, My Date with the President's Daughter, even Smart House, I think I watched for the first time again when I got Disney Plus. But if you haven't seen the films, the recap is not going to help you, my friend, okay? Like, I hadn't seen My Date with the President's Daughter, which Will Friedle starred in, and I hadn't seen Brink. And they recapped both of those films, and I got nothing from the recap. Like, maybe I got like a sense of like the synopsis, like the IMDb synopsis, but I didn't get any sort of sense of like what actually happened in the movie. So I think they're taking on kind of a behemoth of a task because they're recapping an entire 90-minute movie. On Pod Meets World, actually, they recapped Summertime Switch, which Ryder Strong starred in. They were able to do that. And on Office Ladies, they recapped Speed with Keanu Reeves, which is kind of an inside joke for them. They both love Keanu Reeves. I mean, I know there are a lot of other podcasts out there that will recap movies. So I'm surprised that they haven't been able to like fully recap the films. Something else that I noticed is they have a lot of like cutaways, like they have a lot of segments on this podcast. They have a segment called Sabrina Sees, where like Sabrina talks about stuff she noticed in the film that maybe Will didn't notice. And then they have a segment where they read out like reviews, like a good review and a bad review from the movie. And then they have another segment where they basically do like 2 truths and a lie, but with like facts from the movie. It was a lot. I think they can pare down on that. And they have, I've noticed. And also every other week, they will do an interview with somebody who worked on the film that they recapped in the previous episode. I have skipped those except when they interviewed Keely Williams from the Cheetah Girls franchise. I basically skipped the interviews because I don't know who the actors are because I hadn't seen the films. But I have faith in this podcast. I can already see the hosts have better chemistry, and I trust Will Friedle because of how he was on Pod Meets World. But if the recaps continue to be like really confusing, I might just listen to the recaps of films that I've seen. Like, I'm excited for them to recap like High School Musical because I don't think either of them have seen High School Musical. So Magical Rewind, I'm giving it a 3 out of 5 with hope that it will get better. So next up is the podcast Wizards of Waverly Pod, hosted by Jennifer Stone and David DeLuise. This is a rewatch podcast for Wizards of Waverly Place. And I don't like this podcast. I actually stopped listening to this podcast. I gave it a pretty good chance, but the reason I stopped listening to this one is because the recaps were just non-existent. They weren't recapping at all. Like, they would name the episode of the podcast the same episode they're recapping. I didn't take anything away from the recaps. Jennifer Stone and David DeLuise, they have pretty good chemistry. They're both funny. They bounce off each other really well. But I do think they're trying a little bit too hard to like smack talk Disney. I think they're trying too hard to like dig for like the tea. Like, they're trying to like say something really shocking or compelling, but it doesn't really come across that way, and it gets repetitive. They talk about like obviously Selena Gomez, Demi Lovato, all those people that, Jennifer Stone would audition alongside. There's just not a lot to say. So if there's not a lot to say, maybe focus on the show itself and recapping the show, but they don't really do that. So they do have like some passion about the show. Like, they do praise the show. They praise the writing and all that. They do have some interesting interviews. Like, they recently interviewed Tiffany Thornton, who was on Sunny with a Chance, and she hasn't really appeared in interviews in a while. So it was like interesting to hear from her. I do like that, they've Jennifer Stone, she is like a nurse in an ER, and David DeLuise like owns his own restaurant and stuff like that. So I do like how they talk about how they've ventured into other things, and they've talked about like how hard it can be to get work as an actor and things like that. But that's not the point. The point is to talk about the show, and they barely talk about the show itself. So I wouldn't recommend this one, even if you are like a super fan of Wizards of Waverly Place. It's unfortunate, but yeah, I just don't think that they did a very good job. So I was going to give this a 2, but I think I'm going to give it a 1 out of 5. Sorry. It's just not great, and it's an easy skip. It's one of those that's pretty obviously a cash grab. Okay, so last but not least, we're going to be talking about the podcast, and that's what you really missed. This podcast is the Rewatch podcast for the show Glee, and it is hosted by Kevin McHale and Jenna Ushkowitz, who played Artie and Tina on Glee. So I really like this podcast. I think they are handling it as well as they can. If you know, like the show Glee has a lot of controversy in terms of certain actors and on-set dynamics. And I think Jenna and Kevin do a really good job of like addressing those things, but not going into so much like tabloid-esque tea about it, because what I really love about this podcast is that the two of them are very much focused on their perspective of their experience on the show. So they're very much focused on like, well, this is how I experienced going on tour. This is how I experienced my relationship with the producers and the cast and whatnot. The biggest thing that they address is the death of Corey Monteith, who played Finn on the show, and how they continued the show after Finn and Corey had passed. And the quarterback episode, which is an infamous episode of Glee, the characters on the show are grieving the death of Finn, but they filmed that episode mere months after Corey passed. And so the actors were grieving and emoting in their own for Corey, you know, and it just felt kind of wrong to like get that all on camera. So the first episode of the podcast, they actually interviewed Ryan Murphy, the creator of Glee. So Ryan Murphy said, looking back, he would have ended Glee after Corey's death. And they go into it. They talk about it. They have a very candid conversation with him. He's very open and honest. I think that was a great way for them to kick off the podcast. Things they don't address are Mark Salling, who, just look that up. It's too disgusting for me to even say, but Mark Salling also passed away after Glee ended. And then, of course, Naya Rivera passed away. Nothing controversial about Naya Rivera. She was an amazing person, performer, and they don't have enough good things to say about Naya Rivera. And then, you know, Leah Michele has been accused of being racist, being kind of a diva, just like mean, a bully on set. They do tell us that Leah Michele can read. But like I said, this podcast is really enjoyable because they are talking about their own experiences working on the show. And it's really fun to hear from them since they were, you know, supporting characters on the show. Jenna Ushkowitz specifically talks about how she felt underutilized on the show. She comes from Broadway. She has a lot of talent and ability, but they weren't giving her solos. They weren't focusing episodes on her. And a lot of the time, her and Kevin would kind of just be sitting in the choir room for like hours and hours, and they wouldn't have a single line. And then when Jenna Ushkowitz tried to like complain about that to the producers, they basically sent her on a paid vacation, and they filmed the Michael episode without her. I mean, she was still getting paid, so she was okay with it, but she talked about how, you know, that was kind of their response to her acting crazy and like complaining, which like nowadays that wouldn't happen. And they also talk about like the long hours they had to work and kind of their really busy schedules. They would film, they would go on tour, they would come back, start a new season. They barely had time for like their families or friends. They say this, but then they also say, but you know, we're actors. Like we got paid a lot. We got paid fairly for our work, and we got to go home. You know, they talk about the crew a lot. They talk about, well, the crew had to get there before us, and the crew had to leave after us. They interview their fellow Glee actors, Amber Riley, Chris Colfer, Cord Overstreet, have all been on the podcast. And then they also interview the producers, they interviewed the guy who like arranged all their covers. Dude, that guy worked so hard. Like imagine having to arrange 5 to 6, if not more, covers per week. That's crazy. They described Glee as being a once in a lifetime kind of show because it was a lot of labor and not a lot of people would sign up to do that again. In terms of the recaps, I would say they're fairly thorough with their recaps. They actually recap it a little bit differently. Instead of going scene by scene of the episode, they go by storyline. So they'll recap the A storyline, then B, and then C. And I think that's like a good way for them to approach it because Glee has such a huge cast and all the characters on the show are like going through their own things. So it can be hard to keep track. The recaps aren't super, super in-depth. I feel like they could be longer. They focus more on like the musical numbers, how the musical numbers were made, any like behind the scenes facts about that. And I really enjoy that because they were basically making 5 to 6 music videos every single episode. And that's a huge feat. So like, it's really interesting to hear about like their rehearsal process and then the filming itself and how long it would take, especially those competition episodes. Those took forever to film. Obviously, Glee is one of those shows that has may or may not aged well. You know, it's a satire, so like you can kind of take it as humor or you can criticize it. I think it's really funny. I think even though they are being like controversial, I do still enjoy the humor of the show, but they acknowledge that as well. You know, they talk about Mr. Shu and how weird it is that Mr. Shu is like best friends with his students. They did interview Matthew Morrison. I haven't listened to that episode yet, but I'm really excited to listen to it. And they did interview Jane Lynch as well. So like they do talk about like stuff that hasn't aged well. Like they call it the cringe moments. After each recap, they'll like talk about those. They do have like some criticism for the show, like for example, how the show would handle gay storylines, like the storyline with Brittany and Santana, how things were kind of glossed over and how for like the heterosexual couples, their love stories were like heavily focused on. Similar to like Pod Meets World, like they praise when they want to praise and then they criticize when they want to criticize. And I really like that. So, and That's What You Really Missed gets a 4 out of 5. So now on the screen, I'm just going to have all 7 podcasts and their rankings. Definitely recommend Pod Meets World, Office Ladies, and That's What You Really Missed, and Braving the Elements. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it encouraged you to check out a Rewatch podcast. You know, they're not as cringe as you think. Some of them are really well done. And if you're a super fan of these shows, I would definitely recommend watching and listening to your favorite show's Rewatch podcast. It's just so much fun, gives you all the nostalgia, and it's just fun to hear from people you watched growing up. So yeah, more of a lighthearted video this time. My next video will be more of a heavily researched video essay. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, if you've made it this far, thank you so much. Please subscribe. Please give this video a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.